Welcome to AEN's 7th Regional Short Course in Miami, Florida. For those who are joining online, thank you so much for your participation. I'm Miriam Ellman. I'm AEN's Executive Director, and in the room with me are several of my colleagues in the AEN leadership team, along with faculty members from across the state of Florida and the country. We're spending 3 days together engaging on AEN's issues. We're networking with each other. We're learning about current Israeli and Palestinian politics and developments in the Middle East. And we're working together to develop strategies for countering anti-Semitism on campus and in the academy. It's a great pleasure to be able to open this session to our larger membership and to our partners and supporters. And we're really delighted to have with us Robert Greenway, who is the president and executive director of the Abraham Accords Peace Institute. Robert came to head this institute after more than 30 years of a career in public service, including a senior position on the National Security Council. He has served at the Defense Intelligence Agency and is a combat veteran of the U.S. Army Special Forces. His bio, which you can find in your program, provides further details of his distinguished and decorated career. Now, a little over 2 years since the signing of the groundbreaking Abraham Accords, it seems like not a week goes by without some other promising development in the relationship between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan. So many new opportunities, yet also mixed results. In his talk today, we asked Robert to speak retrospectively about the Accords at the 2-year mark, and also to give us his thoughts and his insights about where these historic diplomatic breakthroughs are headed. Robert will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to comments and questions from the floor. And those on Zoom are welcome to stay with us through the Q&A, although you will be on listen and view mode only. Robert, thank you so much for your service, and thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Miriam, for the introduction, and thanks to AEN and to all participating today for the opportunity to speak with you about the Abraham Accords. I propose to tackle this in sort of 4 general subject headings, and then, as stated, get to question and answer and really your interests as soon as possible. The first is the significance of the U.S. role, both in the formation of the Accords and their trajectory. The second is to address briefly the progress that has been made and what it indicates to us that follow it closely. The third is where the real potential resides within the Abraham Accords and what we labor for. And the last is what the future may hold in terms of the impact that the Accords may have more broadly and ways in which they may be challenged. So first, to the significance of the U.S. role. It's hard to overstate how important it was for the United States to play the intermediary role in brokering the relationship between Israel and its neighbors that resulted in the Abraham Accords. And while it appeared at the time, just over 2 years ago, to happen in very short succession, I would say that the result, in my judgment, was the result of a number of different convergent factors that required several years of preparation that ultimately bore fruit for us. And I would say that the ultimate vision behind our approach to the Middle East that resulted in the Accords, I think, is important to recall. So it seems logical to begin there. In the simplest of terms, our approach to the Middle East was consistent across the 4 years I served at the White House, in that we had 2 principal objectives. One was constructive, in that we sought to strengthen the relationship with Israel and between Israel and its neighbors so that we could create a new enduring regional security architecture in the Middle East, which we refer to as the Middle East Strategic Alliance. And I'm happy to talk more about it in question and answer later. The second component of our approach to the region was, for lack of a better term, destructive, in that it sought to address the threat from ISIS, which many will remember encompassed a vast swath of territory between Iraq and Syria, and was launching external operations against the United States and many of our partners and allies around the world, and wreaking incredible harm and havoc to those populations that they could reach in the region. The second Part of this was to confront Iran as the principal threat to peace and stability and security in the Middle East, a view which we shared with Israel certainly, and with our neighbors and partners and allies in the region. So those two components of our policy ultimately guided all of our efforts. And again, we had progress ultimately that resulted in the Abraham Accords, but it was meant to be a step. Second, I would say that ultimately the vision behind the Accords was to present an economic and diplomatic level of cooperation that would warrant security cooperation. And so the argument was that if countries trade together and establish a strong and vibrant economic and therefore diplomatic relationship with one another, that would then lend itself to a security rationale. They would invest the resources to protect and defend that relationship. And I think there are numerous instances historically and in contemporary contexts which support that conclusion. And ultimately that was and remains the vision behind it. And so those two paths with respect to Israel were mutually supportive. And again, we made progress on the Abraham Accords. We made some progress, I think, on the enduring regional security architecture, but we didn't quite get across the goal line on it. And there are reasons, and happy to talk about that later if there are specific questions. The purpose all along was to assure and provide assurance to those entering into new or renewed diplomatic relations with Israel that this was in their best interest. Most of the long-term visions of our partners in the Middle East concluded that they need to be more integrated into the region, into the global economy, and that level of partnership and cooperation included countries with vibrant economies such as Israel. And so it wasn't a huge shift for them, I think, to appreciate the benefits. But again, to stress my first point is that without the US playing an intermediary role, it would be difficult to foresee us achieving the ultimate goal, at least on the timeline that we did so. And it's important to remember, just as the US played a critical role in brokering the Accords, the US continues to play a critical role in determining the future for the Accords, including expansion to other countries. And so it has to be important for the United States to do so. It has to be important for us to support Israel, because none of the countries in the region can be more supportive of a relationship with Israel than the United States is with its relationship. And so it is, again, the fulcrum upon which all of this tends to balance. It was, in our minds, a public-private endeavor to begin with. And our work now at the Institute is designed to do exactly that, to build a public and private consortium of individuals to strengthen and expand the Accords. The second, so how are we doing to date, given the overall context in which we approach the Accords, the rationale for us and the vision for achieving it? How, in our estimation, of the Accord is doing now, some 2.5 years later? And I think I would echo previous comments that there has been remarkable progress. If you get our monthly reports, you'll see it documented in exhaustive detail. And it principally has taken place in trade, but also in the diplomatic sphere, but it encompasses other areas from food security to energy, to sports, health, technology, and innovation, to name a few. But it is, of course, predicated on the individual countries. And so some are progressing at a faster rate than others, which I think is both natural and to be expected. But what we can expect to see is an expansion of time, attention, and benefits for all the countries within the Accords constellation. And for our purposes, Egypt and Jordan, having brokered their original peace agreements with Israel in both 79 and 94, are part of the constellation. We are building on the foundation that they started. But we are mindful that circumstances change. And so the approach with the Accords also was of necessity different in many respects. As I said, progress is certainly remarkable, but it hasn't been approached in a uniform way between all of the different countries. I think the transition in governments in Israel over the past 2.5 years has impacted that, I think, quite naturally. But I also think that that is an important part of the process as these countries get to know one another a little bit better. And as we prioritized up front, there are lots of barriers to interaction between the different countries on not just the diplomatic, but on the economic, and certainly on the security and other domains. And all those had to be addressed. It's It's not easy to open up a bank account in Israel. It's not easy to open up one in other countries within the Accords, as all of you probably know. Exchanging mail, the movement of flights, the movement of merchant traffic in the maritime domain. All of these issues had to be addressed by the governments up front to enable progress in the private sector. We're starting to see the benefits of that now. The Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement between Israel and the UAE, or the Free Trade Agreement, as it's more commonly termed, will just now begin to take effect. And we can expect to see, I think, an expansion in the already tremendous economic trade that's taking place between the two countries, but it's just the beginning. So second then on the potential, or third rather, the potential of the Accords. In our minds, this was not to be just a series of bilateral relationships between Israel and its individual neighbors, but it was really going to be the sum greater than their individual parts. That the integration of all of these countries, their economies, and cooperation across the spectrum would result in the real benefits of the Accords. We knew that, as these countries do, that they sit between the European, the Asian, and the American markets. And that is an incredibly important geographic position that really has never been fully exploited. And so now I think they're starting to appreciate that all of the countries together can achieve what they cannot do individually or even on a bilateral basis. And moreover, that is probably the most practical way for them to achieve their goals by 2030 or 2050, which in many cases is transition from a petrochemical-based economy to a knowledge-based economy in many respects. And that level of cooperation, again, is just beginning. But it also means that the Europeans and our Asian markets and countries and governments, our partners in each of those areas, has an important role to play as well in encouraging the Accords to achieve their full potential and encourage other countries that are not yet part of the constellation to join. Specifically, just to give you some examples, we have been spending a lot of time engaging European partners, not just to build legislative support in the parliaments across the continent and in the UK, but also to highlight to them that one of the solutions to their pressing energy problem as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the loss of some 43% of their energy supplies thereof can and should come from partners and allies in the Middle East, which encompass the Abraham Accords countries, not just as suppliers, but as potential investors in the infrastructure required to connect the two regions. We see this as all to the good, and ultimately, I think, a way to get to where Europe knows it needs to be. And we all, I think, have a role to play. Second, on the food security side, working in the reverse, I think also as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but even before, water and food security have been a perennial issue in the Middle East. It's not going to abate anytime soon. And so cooperation there is required. And in fact, we are working with Abraham Accords member countries and commercial partners to develop a joint commercial agricultural venture in Sudan to retain their membership in the Accords by demonstrating the benefits to the average citizens, to reverse the trends in agricultural productivity, to increase it. As you know, 15 years ago, they used to be a net exporter. Since they've been a net importer, we're looking to help them reverse that. And in our minds, a cooperative arrangement between commercial entities and the Abraham Accords is the ideal path forward. And we're making good progress on it, and happy to talk more about that if there's interest. We also see the benefits of something resembling an Abraham Accords free trade zone resulting from the cooperation between these individual countries. It's an idea that's been proffered before. It exists in other regions of the world in different contexts, and to our minds would be, I think, an optimal way for the countries to collaborate and to cooperate on a range of different issues. It's often said that Israel is an island separated from its neighbors as a result of conflict and competition with their neighbors. But the reality is that most every country in the region is largely isolated from its neighbors for a variety of factors. Intra-GCC trade has historically been less than 15%. And so countries in conflict with each other, European countries and Russia come to mind, are probably trading more than some GCC countries are with their neighbors, even though there's absolutely no conflict and nothing but cooperation and amity. And so I think ultimately we see an important role for a broader constellation of countries and trade in the region. And in fact, those with an existing free trade agreement with the United States can cooperate and leverage their different but related free trade agreements with the United States to mutual advantage. And again, this is something that the United States can help bring to fruition. Lastly, and then would certainly welcome questions from all of you, is where we think the accords are headed. In our mind, the people-to-people cooperation will require additional time of necessity, and I think it also require great effort, and where we are going to focus additional time and attention. Popular support for normalization achieved a peak insofar as we can tell when the agreements were concluded in the fall of 2020, but they've since declined to pre-normalization levels, and that's going to require some time. Again, the individual people in each of the Accord member countries, I think, has to see the benefits of membership in the Accords and normalization with Israel. And certainly we think that's not only possible, it's more than probable, but it is going to require effort to do so, and it will require time. We're working assiduously with partners in order to bring that about. The second, as related to tourism from Israel to the Accord member countries, is certainly recovering from COVID, and lots of Israelis can be found now in capitals of Accord member countries, and that's a wonderful thing to see. But fewer, I think, tourists from Abraham Accord member countries are traveling to Israel, even after COVID restrictions have abated. And that's something that we are turning our attention to as well. And obviously that impacts the broad spectrum of people-to-people contact. To that end, we are working on, and it may be of interest to many of you in this audience, and we're working on an Abraham Accords Scholars and Fellows program with a lot of US institutions and some in Europe and in the region, in order to exchange students and faculty and staff among academic institutions among the Abraham Accords member countries, as well as youth exchanges for those aged 18 to 25 from each of the Accord member countries, as well as a number of different athletic events that are scheduled over the next year in order to bring the people of these countries together in a friendly way to demonstrate what the potential of the partnership really is. And in the end, what we'd like to see is a regaining of momentum to add countries to the Abraham Accords so that we can, again, demonstrate that this is something that is in the best interest of all of Israel's neighbors, and there are remarkable benefits to be enjoyed by participating. And again, as I said before, this is in fact a playing field requiring both public and private institutions. We all have a role in supporting and encouraging the peace that has come about between Israel and its neighbors. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to encourage them. To that end, we're about to publish a list that we have been developing on resources available to support Middle East peace more broadly, both from public and private institutions. We'd appreciate feedback when it's live. And the goal there is to identify resources that aren't being utilized. Hopefully, members of the Accord member countries individually and organizationally can take advantage of it. And if there are in fact gaps, we can perhaps take strides to fill those gaps and encourage, again, the exchange both in a private and in an economic sphere between the Accord member countries. And lastly, again, just to reemphasize the point that the US played a critical role in this, it will play a critical role in events like we're seeing this week alone in the UAE with the Negev working groups meeting. And our hope is to see this become institutionalized so that the countries can achieve the visions that resulted in the Abraham Accords. But there is in fact a role for all of us to play, both publicly and privately. And the Institute is established in recognition of that, so that we can continue on the work that resulted in it and to build to help them achieve their full potential. I'm grateful for the chance to speak with all of you today, and I look forward to your questions and appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you for all the work that you and your institute are doing to further these historic agreements. I think we should open it up to questions, or yes, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Oh, I'm Irish Eskin, University of Miami. There was one development related to the Abraham Accords this week, which surprised me, although I think I have an explanation for it. And that is, I think that I would have thought the next most likely country, Arab country, to want to join would have been Oman. Israel's had pretty good relationships with Oman over the years. So is the United States. The University of Miami, by the way, trained a good portion of Omani doctors, okay? And now, all of a sudden, this year, this week, they outlawed contact with Israelis in any way. My explanation, I think, is that the Saudis told them to do that because they didn't want to do it themselves. And that's a kind of warning to Netanyahu not to go too far. What do you think?
Well, I appreciate the question. Like you, we observed it. And in point of fact, it's short of a law being passed, outlaw normalization. It's more like a motion presented before the cabinet. But look, to your broader point, in terms of the trajectory, there was progress made between Israel and Oman. Prime Minister, then Prime Minister, now again, Prime Minister Netanyahu famously made a very public visit to visit the Oman and the former Sultan. But after the transition and the death of Sultan Qaboos and Sultan Haitham has since taken the reins, I think you can expect, obviously, the relationship has to be rebuilt. I would not take the public sentiments as indicative of Oman's final position. It will require a good deal of work. I think I could understand why you might believe that the Saudis may have been behind the action taken. My sense is that's not the case. While they may or may not encourage others to take the step, I think in Oman's case, the relationship between Muscat and Riyadh has never been particularly strong, certainly given the conflict in Yemen and the friction between the two positions on the approach and resolution of it. So where I generally judge Oman to be is with new leadership having to reestablish a relationship that took a great deal of time to achieve. But I think what is going to be decisive in this is the position that the United States takes. And ultimately, if the signal sent to Oman is to encourage normalization with Israel, then I think you can expect to see positive results from that. If, on the other hand, Washington does not strongly encourage Muscat to take that step or take steps in that direction, then I think it's unlikely they're going to take that risk because they'd have little incentive to do so. And I also think historically, there has been a desire on the part of many to leverage Oman's relationship with Iran in order to play an intermediary role. In my own judgment, it's both unnecessary and unhelpful, and not least of which to Oman itself. Ultimately, I think the key to Oman's future prosperity includes greater integration between Oman and its neighbors, and that includes Israel.
Thank you. Gunter?
Yeah, Gunter Kelly from Indiana University. I've got two questions. One is, there were a number of different reasons for each country to sign up to that, who participated in the agreements. But my sense is that for a long time, it worked for Arab governments to blame Israel for lots of things. And is that now shifting, or do they, can they still use it? And how does the population play any role in this? Now, are trying the governments to take the population with them, with some means, or what's the situation there? And my second question is on Morocco. So Morocco, I've been following for some time. It seemed to me that Morocco, the king of Morocco, had, long before, years before the Abraham Accords, he had tried to open up the country and warm up somehow relations with the Israelis and Jews, sometimes against the political parties in the country. So, what's the situation there in Morocco? I would like to hear your views on that.
Certainly, and appreciate both questions. First, to motives and the popular support for normalization. You're right in that each of the countries that established or resumed diplomatic relations with Israel had different motivations. there are commonalities. There's obviously and this has, I think, been made public, sometimes extended perhaps a little bit too far, but they certainly shared the view that the principal threat to all of their peace, stability, and security was Iran. The conference that Secretary Pompeo held in Warsaw some 2 years before the Accords, or a year and a half before the Accords, reflected exactly that. And that recognition is important. But there are also fundamental differences among each of the countries, some of which had a more acute security situation than the others. And so you could say that security dominated the rationale. Second, those that sort of prioritize economic goals and objectives certainly looked toward Israel and continue to look to Israel as being part of their economic future prosperity and diversification and integration with the region and access to other markets. And so there was a spectrum of motivations that existed between in the individual countries. But I would say also that this was something that I think all of the countries that brokered deals, we helped broker deals with Israel, they had long since, I think, arrived at this conclusion and were awaiting circumstances that would allow them to do so. And a big part of that was a partner in Washington to help broker an agreement between countries that frankly did not have significant ties. Good news is those ties are expanding as time goes on, but the relationships and trust associated, those things don't happen overnight. In terms of popular support within each of the countries, you're right in that each country has a different relationship with its population, and there's a different degree of popular support that plays into their calculations. So some countries are more dependent upon popular support for a given decision than others. And I think that's always the case. And that's why, as I said, it's important for us to work to demonstrate the benefits of membership to individual citizens so that those that made the decision can point to the popular support and demonstrate to them the benefits of membership to get additional support. And those that do not enjoy popular support for normalization can take strides to persuade their population that this is ultimately in their best interest. And many of them suffering from unemployment now and looking at the prospects as they transition economically to a different model, I think there's a good argument to be made for integration, better integration with Israel from an economic perspective alone. So I think that there's work to be done. But each country approaches, I think, the degree of popular support differently. But in every case, it's a factor. I would add one other thing that I think we often misjudge where our partners and allies are in the Middle East broadly and in Arab countries in particular. And I think we labor under assumptions that don't necessarily stand the test of scrutiny for a long period of time. And I think the Accords reflect one of those, which is the principal cause of friction between Israel and its neighbors being the Palestinian conflict. And I would say that in the case of the Abraham Accords member countries and others that have yet to join, they do not see the Israeli-Palestine conflict as the determining factor behind their relationship with Israel or their approach to regional stability and security. And so I think it's important for us to get a better sense of where Arab populations are, Middle Eastern populations are relative to support for normalization, because I don't think right now we've got as good a diagnosis as we probably should have. And that's something that we in particular are interested to resolve over the coming year.
Thank you. Joseph.
The second question, sorry, I didn't want to neglect. The second question was on Morocco. So it's interesting to watch how Morocco has handled its internal political situation, which ultimately, I think, bore tremendous fruit the last parliamentary elections. And a number of parties hostile to normalization with Israel were swept from power. There are a number of other remarkable factors affecting that election, but it was certainly interesting to watch. Ultimately, I think everyone knows that the degree of cultural connection between Morocco and Israel is strong. There's a significant percentage of the Israeli population that has roots in Morocco. Many of their former, some of their current cabinet officials claim residency there. when we made the first flight from Israel to Morocco, the then National Security Advisor, Meir Ben Shabat, addressed public television in Darija, just reflecting his ties and his family's ties to Morocco, and it had a tremendous impact. So the ties are there historically and culturally. The impediment to, in our judgment, to achieving the full benefits of normalization and taking additional steps between the two countries is, in our judgment, Israel recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over the southern provinces, as the United States have done and that many European countries done, either recognizing the autonomy plan as proffered being the only viable path forward, or simply recognizing their sovereignty, which is de facto true. And so in that sense, we believe, and under those circumstances, that Israel and Morocco can take the next steps, exchange additional high-level visits, exchange ambassadors, and then begin to open the doors of trade and economic cooperation to a much larger level. Now, we think this is going to happen. It's just a matter of when. We believe that now that the new Israeli government is establishing itself, that it will not have to wait long to see that happen. And then we'll see these two countries, I think, begin to take strides that we had already envisioned. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes, Joseph Kanitsky from the University of Miami. Thank you, Robert, for sharing with us such important topics. Initially, you mentioned that maybe you would like to share with us a little bit more about the Middle East Strategic Alliance. And I was wondering if what is driving it are economic and trade factors, or is it security defense related, especially in light of the ongoing war in Ukraine and the heavy participation of Iran within that war that sends very dangerous signals to the rest of the region?
Of course, and thanks for asking. So as I said up front, we were trying on the constructive side to achieve two things: to construct an enduring regional security architecture, connecting our partners and allies in a more cohesive way. And the second was to normalize as many of Israel's neighbors from a diplomatic perspective. And we thought that those two things would converge naturally at some point in the future. As it happens, we achieved remarkable success on the normalization track with the Abraham Accords. We achieved less success than we wanted to with the new enduring regional security architecture, mostly because of bureaucratic resistance within the US government, I have to say, less so on our partners and allies who are enthusiastic about it. And in fact, not surprisingly, wanted us to go a little bit further than departments and agencies within the government were willing to go. But I do think that over time, it is something that will be achieved. And look, it's important in this respect. Across the political spectrum in the United States, there's a broad recognition that our investment in the Middle East in terms of material and resources has been excessive. And there is large consensus about constraining the resources that the US government commits to foreign enterprises, and the Middle East is chief among those. That's number one. And number two, obviously, we have been committed to a greater or lesser extent for many decades in the Middle East, and it has cost the United States a tremendous amount. And there's a great deal of doubt and uncertainty of the dividends we achieved as a result of doing it. And I can personally attest to that, having participated in a good bit of it for many years. And I understand it. Third, the solution to this, in my mind, has always been not an increase or even sustaining long-term the US commitment to the Middle East in particular, but it is to make our partners and allies more capable with our support of addressing the full range of threats, whether it's terrorism in the form of ISIS, or whether it's state-sponsored terrorism and the threat of proliferation from Iran. And look, the national security interests paramount have always been economic. In 1979, Carter's determination was that the United States must protect the oil exports in order to fuel America's economic growth from the Middle East. Our economic interests are not the same. We no longer require Middle Eastern oil and gas to sustain our economy, but our partners and allies in the global economy does. And so it is still in our vital national interests, I would argue, for us to maintain a balance of global markets. And as the principal architects and beneficiary of an integrated global economy, I think the United States has little choice. Again, in my mind, the real choice is how we do this. And MESA, the point behind a new enduring regional security architecture in the Middle East with US leadership, was to make our partners and allies together more capable of doing so, so it would require less commitment of resources from the United States and our partners and allies. And this is the same approach we've taken in Europe, and it's a similar approach that we're taking in Asia, logically so. I would add also that not only is Europe increasingly going to be dependent upon external energy supplies, including from the Middle East, I think logically, but China's energy requirements right now are some 45% of its energy comes from Middle East, and that's going to grow. It's not going to decrease. And I think strategically, it makes no sense to cede this strategic vulnerability and advantage to China and allow them to control global markets, which they would be more than happy to do. And I would add one further point in that we had achieved a level of cooperation with our partners and allies. And so we managed to secure a massive increase in oil output or in the change in the oil markets in August of 2020 to the tune of 9 million barrels a day. We're hard pressed to get 100,000 barrels a day out of OPEC plus. And the difference is our approach in the region. And so there's lots of different ways to do this, but I would argue that cooperation beats competition in this part of the world and serves our interest better. But that was the vision. The obstacles, again, were reluctance on the part of many departments and agencies in the US to proceed. There's some understandable reasons why, but ultimately, I think everyone recognized that cooperation and building an effective team in the region was our best interest. Where we differed, I think, is in the method of approach. My hope is that they'll maybe be able to make strides in this, but it's not likely to happen unless we improve our relationship with Saudi Arabia and Egypt, two of the most important regional and geostrategic players within the Middle East, and two of our longest partners and allies in the region. And it's incumbent upon us, I think, to rebuild the relationships in both cases, because they will be integral, if not the most important parts of building that enduring regional security architecture. And the last thing I'll say is we've seen how this potentially can play out to our disadvantage when you look at the Iranian attack against Abqaiq and Quraysh in Saudi Arabia in September 2019. And thankfully, it did not have the impact that it could have had, but I think it demonstrated to everyone in the region what Iran, in this case, was able to do. And it necessitated, I think, a response which ultimately led to the strikes that happened in early January of 2020. But a cooperative region working together on not just air defense, but also deterrence collectively, I think offers a better path forward and protects and safeguards our partners, allies, our own interests in infrastructure, and the stability of a global energy market, which we all depend upon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Please, David.
I'm David Gatlin. I teach at Ohio at Southern Methodist University. I have a question. Earlier, you had said that because of the agreements you saw, Israelis engage in tourism to the other countries involved in the Abraham agreements, but you were disappointed that there were fewer tourists from those other countries going to Israel. I'm curious, why do you think that lack of tourism occurred?
It's a great question. It's one we spend a lot of time discussing. I think some of the reasons are obvious, some perhaps less so. First, it's important to remember that COVID restrictions have lingered, and the Abraham Accords agreements, of course, were struck in nearly the middle of the global pandemic, a time in which most countries were greatly restricting the movement of individuals into their countries for logical reasons. And we're still now, I think, just coming out of it. So that's point number one. The second, I think, comes down to risk. Each of the Accord member countries, I think, and individually and corporately, gauge their travel and their relationship with Israel in terms of risk, the cost and benefit analysis. And so I think there's a reluctance on the part of many individual citizens of Abraham Accord member countries to, in some cases, to visit Israel because they're not sure of what the consequences are. They've been led to believe a number of things may or may not happen. They may or may not be well received. They may or may not either there or when they return. And so I think there's a lot of misinformation and misperception about it. And because you haven't seen many go, there's not enough to come back and say, not only are there no risks associated with going, generally speaking, but it's a great place to visit, and it's one that holds remarkable benefits from a personal standpoint. So there haven't been enough ambassadors, so to speak, to go back having traveled as yet. The third reason I think is that we're still building the connections between these countries mechanically. So flights are occurring, but it'll take some time for the airlines, I think, to adjust. Some of that is demand driven, of course, because they are for-profit businesses. And so there has to be demand generated in order to get the flights necessary for Accord member countries to have their citizens go. And then lastly, it's, I think, in some cases, a capacity issue. All of us, I think, that travel to Israel regularly over the years would recognize it's a great experience, and they've made tremendous strides to accommodate tourists that they're dependent upon for some 6% of their GDP. You know, as a unique country with things that only Israel can offer, it has a unique obligation. But I also think that we and Israel recognizes that there's a need to expand their infrastructure to accommodate more tourists. And so I think that that is likely to involve and incur time and attention, and it will make it easier for more visitors to come to the country, to come to Israel from Accord member countries. The last thing I think that we're looking at very closely is cooperating again as part of the solution. So instead of individual Abraham Accords member countries competing for the same tourists, we think that there's room for greater cooperation, so that tourists that come to Israel can not just go to Israel, but they can easily go from Israel to other countries. And that takes time in order to achieve. There's a number of security and health restrictions and constraints that have to be addressed. None of those are easy, but our belief is that it's worthwhile, and that with the new Israeli government just coming in, we'll have another opportunity, I think, to address those issues and make it easier for Arab Muslims from Accord member countries to visit Israel. And we're hopeful that they will over the coming year.
Yes, can you relate a little bit to, I'm from Palm Beach State College. Okay. Question, Sudan, can you relate to Sudan? You know, it's a country that has been under sanctions, a country that was ruled at one point by a Muslim fundamentalist, then by a dictatorship. And then the normalization, to a certain extent, came as a surprise, at least to me, and I don't think I'm the only one. So,
So it's a great question, and I appreciate you asking it. So look, the significance of Sudan, of Khartoum, reversing the 3 no's after the '67 war can't be overstated. That number one. Number two, you're right in that this was not the only significant reversal after the fall of Omar al-Bashir. They were obviously charting a new course. Normalization became part of it, but the United States was working with Khartoum to reverse course so that they could be removed from the state-sponsored terrorism list, which resulted in enormous isolation diplomatically and economically as a result of the policies that they pursued and their support for terrorism. So once the government changed and they decided to change course, the United States worked with them. In due course, it became, I think, an important for both us and for Khartoum to address the normalization question. We got the favorable response, and they joined the Accords. Obviously, a country that was as isolated as Sudan was going to take some time. There were no established there were very few diplomatic facilities established there. Most of the presence were relatively small. Israel didn't have a history of cooperation with the government. largely. And so a lot of that was literally starting from ground zero. Again, the US role here becomes the most important, but other Abraham Accord member countries played an important role in encouraging Sudan as well, and they should be recognized for it. And I would also say that that things have slowed greatly since the coup of October of now 22. And once that occurred, Western governments in the US in particular, official policy became largely one of isolation until the Sovereign Transitional Council returned to the Juba Agreement and accepted civilian leadership and was back on a path to elections. It's all of our hope, of course, that happens as it should. But it is problematic because the 5 in Sudan have yet to come to agreement. There have been recent announcements of a safeguard plan and steps being taken to resolve the political impasse. And we're hopeful that that will occur. The US has played a role in this. The Quad and the Troika and UNIMAS have played constructive roles. And we're hopeful that it will achieve results. Until that happens, our goal is to set conditions for a better integration once that political impasse is resolved. And I mentioned, I think before, that we're working on an agricultural venture between Moroccan fertilizer company. They're one of the most impressive, the largest fertilizer company in the world, one of the most impressive companies by all accounts. OCP has established an office in Sudan, started first fertilizer shipments, and we've helped get them established in that market, and they'll play a critical role in reversing agricultural productivity problems in Sudan. But we're also integrating Israeli agricultural firms with irrigation and precision fertilizer application, precision pesticide application, and a host of other capabilities to aid Sudan and help them increase agricultural productivity and provide for their own people instead of being dependent upon foreign aid. And we're working with the World Food Program as well in order to bring this about, and the investment and involvement of other Accord member countries. And so all of us together can help, I think, keep Sudan within the Accords framework until such time as the political impasse is resolved. Second, help resolve the acute food security and water security issues experienced by the population there. 3, address the scarcity of international food aid as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and other factors. And 4, alleviate the suffering of the people of Sudan and demonstrate the benefits that the Accord member countries and normalization with Israel comprise. We're making good progress on that front. We've got an important visit coming up in the next couple of weeks. You will probably see, and hopefully we'll be able to begin work there soon. And hopefully the political impasse will be resolved. It's important, and it requires time and attention to do it. And again, the US is going to be playing a pivotal role in helping it.
That is terrific.
Thank you. Maybe I'll ask a question. Actually 2. A general one and a specific one. The general one is, we're academics in the US. We're very concerned about anti-Semitism on campus. We're concerned about the delegitimization of Israel. And you spoke, in the start of your remarks on Sudan about this transformation from 1967 and the 3 no's to today. What are some suggestions you have for us? Like how do we bring what's happening in the real Middle East to our campuses? What might you suggest? We know that, for example, the group Sharaka has made some rounds of campuses, and that's been very effective, and they've come into the communities as well. But I'm curious what else you might advise for us. So that's sort of the general question. And the second question is, before you came online, we were having a general discussion about some of the criticisms that have been raised about the Abraham Accords. One of which is that, unlike the Jordanian and Egyptian agreements, the Abraham Accords don't include provisions for the Palestinians. And so we were talking about ways of countering that argument, and sort of suggesting that no, in fact, this is the Accords can uplift Palestinians as well. I'm curious about what your institute or others who, are working on this are doing to raise the voice of Palestinians, in the West Bank, in particular, but also, do you see Israeli Arabs, as potentially, actors in the middle that can counter that argument? So what's being done in terms of Arabs with Israeli citizenship and then Palestinians, and particularly in the West Bank?
Great questions. Let me take the first one. What can organizations like yours and others do to help? I would look at this in three ways. The first is within the US, there is, I think, a need for education. I think there is not a great appreciation for the problems or the solutions. Most people associate the Middle East with this, interminable, never-ending conflict, which has no foreseeable resolution, which may or may not impact everyday Americans in their lives. On both counts, they're wrong. But I think it takes a conscious effort to provide the information necessary for people to form their own conclusions. And that's not an easy thing. So I think so hosting individuals from the region, groups like Sharka, Israelis, and a host of others, I think we have partnered with to do it. We've gotten out to a number of different universities. We do it on a fairly regular basis. And we're happy to do more of it and to help other organizations do more of it. So I think the discussion on college campuses with both faculty and students is a good one. And I think it makes sense to be able to present why the US, this is in US interest, why the Accords is a good thing. And look, none of us, I think, would have predicted that at this particular point in time, we'd have a land war in Europe, the first and the Second World War, and yet we're talking about peace in the Middle East. And that's a juxtaposition that warrants discussion in and of itself. And obviously the two are somewhat related. The second is internationally. And I think that because academic institutions have extensive networks globally, that there is an enormous and important role to play. That could come in the form of research and analysis. We spend a lot of time looking for partners on research and analysis, frankly, to demonstrate the incentives for taking specific steps. I'll give you an example. We're constantly working with both Egypt and Jordan to allow for expanded overland trade with Israel. It's in their interest, it's in Israel's interest, it's in everyone's interest. And there's enormous economic benefit. But almost nobody, really nobody, has done the required research and analysis to be able to tell me what that economic incentive is so that I can approach the governments and provide the necessary decision and tell them, this is so important. The benefits are such that you should invest in the solution to this particular problem. And that would, again, tie the countries closer together. And once you have a beneficial trade relationship, it improves a host of other areas. It has a lot of other derivative benefit effects. And so we're keen to work with organizations, especially academic institutions, that are or are willing to work with us on research and analysis to demonstrate the incentives for doing things. And that includes, by the way, and I'll come to it shortly, benefits to Palestinian people themselves. But I'll come back to that. And also I would say that in the international sense, you've got students in academic institutions from a number of different countries. It was already mentioned, you've got a number of Omanis studying in universities represented by those in attendance today. You've got students from Accord member countries and prospective Accord member countries, and that's a tremendous advantage. And that, I think, should be leveraged. You provide a space in which these conversations could be had with safety, and they could be had in some cases with the required anonymity. And you could have these discussions with some of the most elite members of society who are selected to go and study abroad. And that's a huge advantage that I don't think we're taking into account, but should. And so I think that's a place where universities, colleges in the US and internationally can play an enormous role in rewarding those countries and recognizing the step that they took to join the Accords and encouraging participation. All of you know that the population of many of these countries in the Middle East are predominantly and increasingly young. And so you've got an important segment of the population in your classrooms and on your campuses. And I think it's worth engaging and providing them a place to engage each other and build relationships that'll bear fruit down the line, which is what our Scholars and Fellows program was designed to do. And on that note, we are working with Stanford, NYU, and Cambridge in the UK, and we're happy to work with other institutions in the United States and internationally to help the Abraham Accords member countries establish exchange programs for students, faculty, and staff to build those long-term relationships that will ultimately bear fruit in the years to come. All of you have far more experience at that than certainly I do. And so we're keen to leverage that expertise to help us build the program out and help them get to where they need to be. And it also encompasses other disciplines that are present in college campuses and universities and could bear fruit in cooperation in healthcare, in cooperation in a number of different fields. And so there's no reason why an American institution or institutions couldn't develop a program for Accords member countries and prospective member countries on your college campuses and universities, again, to cement these relationships and approach these countries in appropriate ways collectively as opposed to individually. And that also includes in the region. A number of US and international universities and college campuses have a presence in the Middle East, and that is growing. And that is an ideal venue to support, sustain, and expand the Accords. And I think we can do more to leverage that, which is one of the reasons why NYU is helping us on the Scholars and Fellows programs, because they've got a campus in the UAE. And so there's huge opportunity for universities and academic institutions to support, from research and analysis to support for programs and development to education of not only the student bodies, but local communities, I think, as well. To your second question on Palestinian issue, while I said up front that no country in the region wanted to make it the focal point or the pivot point for their policy and engagement, it's important to all of them. And they all wanted to leverage the Abraham Accords to set conditions for a resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And they still want to, and they're very eager to do it. They're looking for the opportunities which they can't generate themselves. And we had established after the Accords upfront a fund specifically for infrastructure projects in the West Bank and in surrounding Israeli territories that would have direct and significant impact on a number of Palestinians. And those projects sort of fell off the radar when the fund was mothballed, essentially, when the transition occurred. I don't think it was intentional. I think it was just a matter of policy review. Everything became, it was subject to a policy review, which is natural for a transition. But I think that there's no reason that could not be resurrected, and the countries in question would not commit resources to develop infrastructure. I'll give you some examples. This includes building new personnel checkpoints so that Palestinians could transit from their place of residence to their workplace far more efficiently than is currently the case. I think all of those of you that have seen it can easily attest to the fact that it's far from ideal and could easily be fixed and improved without a compromise in security. And it would, I think, be welcomed by all parties. The second is infrastructure projects related to tourism infrastructure in and around the West Bank and a number of different religious and other sites, which still require development. And then the movement of trade of goods and services, not just people, across and from Judea, Samaria, the Palestinian territories, and Israel. And then lastly, again, as Israel sits at an important geographic location, there is no reason why the economic benefits of greater integration with Europe, with Egypt, and with Jordan would also have tremendous impact on Palestinians, both in the territories as well as in Jordan, for example. And so the Accords provide an opportunity to do it. The last thing I'll say is that we and the Accords member countries themselves are not only looking for these opportunities, we're breathing new life into old ideas and resurrecting new ones to make them possible. I think the transition in governments in Israel will again add, I think, additional impetus to some of these projects. And to my earlier point, there's plenty of opportunity for colleges and universities to help support with research and analysis that can help us demonstrate why this is economically important and useful and productive work to do. That would benefit a great many people. And that makes a compelling argument that's difficult to resist. But in many cases, that's absent from the equation.
Thank you so much, Robert, for spending the hour with us and sharing the work that you've done, the work that the Institute continues to do. We so value it, and we will be in touch because I asked that question specifically for examples, and I saw a lot of heads nodding in the room. So we have a network of almost 900 faculty on almost 300 campuses across the United States, and every discipline, including many of those you raised in STEM, health, public health, social sciences, humanities, etc. So I look forward to staying in touch with you, as does my leadership team, as does our faculty network. And thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate it. Great to be with all of you. Look forward to the next conversation.
Bye-bye.